Good afternoon all, thanks for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, on today's webinar, which is 5 photos, 5 edits. So taking 5, hopefully, if we get through them, and doing various different edits and techniques in Capture One. Now, before we get to that, a couple of housekeeping things. So this is being streamed out on few different places, so it's going out in our webinar room and also out on our Facebook and YouTube page, so you can see the sticky message if you're in the webinar room, with also the YouTube link should you have any speed or streaming issues or anything like that. There is rather a lot of you today, and I am flying solo, so I will do my best to keep an eye on all the various different questions and comments that come in. But if I don't get to your specific question, please don't be offended. As I said, there is rather a lot of you, so we just try and pick out some of the common threads, and once the transmission is over, we can always trawl back through the comments and answer a few more there as well. So if you don't get a live answer, please don't be disappointed. A couple of other housekeeping things. We have 60 minutes today. We're not going to go over that. We just about squeaked in 5 shots this morning when we did the webinar. So I'll do my best not to waffle on too much. Regarding the recording, this is being recorded, but as it's streaming to Facebook and YouTube, it's just available there instantly as soon as this is finished, so that's nice and easy. As I said, you're very welcome to submit your questions anytime. I'll keep an eye on the comments coming up on YouTube and Facebook as well. And for those of you in the webinar room, you will get a little short exit survey later on, so please feel free to answer that as well. If you're in the webinar room answering questions, it's best if you keep them to the Q&A tab. Otherwise, they're hard to determine between the main chat and so on. So just try and keep your questions in there. For those of you on YouTube and Facebook, then it's pretty easy. I'm sure you've figured it out what to do. If you want to hide the chat in the webinar room, you can just click that arrow and then it will disappear and give you a bit more real estate. So let us begin. So without further ado, let's just bring up the screen like so, and have a look at the shots that we are going to attempt to edit today. You can see various different variants because we obviously did this transmission earlier today. So you'll see a few different variations of the edits we did and so on. Very unlikely what I'm going to do this afternoon is going to match with this morning, but we shall do our best. So we've got a landscape, a food shot, a very nice portrait, which you can see in the center here, and then a wedding shot where we've got a couple of options for wedding, and then finally finishing up with a lifestyle shot as well. So that's our plan for today. So let's dive in first of all and go to our landscape shot. I'm just going to hide the browser, so that's Command B, and have a look at this shot from my friend John McDermott. This is the Dolomites in Italy. No adjustments on it right now. Pretty good straight out of camera. The only thing that immediately springs to my mind, of course, is that the mountains in the background, they're a little bit washed out, a little bit hazy, which is perfectly natural, but we might like to mitigate that a little bit. So what we're going to do is deal with kind of the global corrections first of all, and then we're going to think about how, with a few little clever tricks, we can reduce that density of those mountains in the background. So first of all, as I said, exposure is pretty good, so I might just up the contrast a touch and also throw in a little bit of clarity as well, and hit auto on my levels just to kind of bring that density or richness in the contrast and so on. Now I'm not going to go too much further with playing with the trees, but as they're a little bit dark, I might just open up the blacks a little bit as well. So they're looking pretty nice at the front. So really what we have to do to deal with is this part separately. Now, as I said, it's a bit bright, it's a bit washed out. We could try and manipulate it with the sliders, but this is probably one of those situations where we can't really have a global adjustment for all, so we're going to have to use some element of local adjustment. So over in our layers panel, hiding over here on the left hand side, we're going to grab our gradient mask, and then we're going to draw from top to bottom. Where I start drawing, the mask will be the strongest, and where I finish drawing, it will have faded out to 0. So if I press M on my keyboard, you'll be able to see the mask. Now, right now, that's quite a gradual fall off. I really only want to kind of target it to the top half. So what we can do with our shortcut finger is hold our Alt key down and then drag up the bottom line, and that makes our mask asymmetric, like so. So now it's going to have a slightly more abrupt fall off. So that's given us a good mask up in the top end. So what can we do to darken this area down? Well, straight away, if I start manipulating with exposure, that's giving us a nice result. We could argue that's maybe too much, but it's also darkening the top of the trees, which isn't an ideal situation, if you like. So how can we sort of manipulate our mask so it follows that tree line nicely? And Alan has chimed in straight away and said, would a luminosity mask not be appropriate here? So definitely Alan is on ball here for sure. So what we're going to do is actually use a combination of the two. Now, before we do anything else, I'm going to turn on my grayscale mask. So what the grayscale mask is, represent the mask to us in different shades of grey. Now, white is where the mask is present, and black is where there is no masking. For those of you guys who said you didn't have sound, you do have to click for audio if you're in the webinar room, but also look up the top where the sticky is, and you'll see a YouTube link as well. You could also try watching on YouTube if you don't have any luck in here as well. So give that a go as well. But in the middle of the picture, there is a click for audio button that you have to hit at the start. Sorry for that little segue. So as I said, white is where there's masking, black is where there's no masking, and it had that abrupt cutoff through the tree line, which is what we don't want. So what we're going to do is hit Luma Range, and that's going to bring us up a box here, as you can see. And what we can do is restrict the luminosity range of that mask. So it's going to modify our mask. So what I want is just those highlights really. So I'm going to pull the highlights across, and then we're going to gradually move this one up until we get something kind of like that, which is pretty good. So it's given me my gradient in the sky, but it's following the tree line quite nicely. Now, the way this mask looks, we'd probably get away with it, but it's probably a fairly hard sort of crude edge around those trees. So what we need to do is soften that up a bit, and this is where the two sliders underneath down here, radius and sensitivity, this is where they come into play. Now by default radius is at 0, so that cuts out the action of sensitivity. So sensitivity won't do anything until we bump up the radius. So if I increase the radius, let's bring this up to a good healthy amount. This now brings the sensitivity slider into play. Now the sensitivity slider has a bias, if you like, from either feathering the mask. So if we put sensitivity down to 0, it's going to get very soft, which kind of is good for skin tones and other things sometimes. If we want to wrap tightly around the edges of our mask, then we can increase sensitivity all the way up to 100. So you need that. So you see that's kind of sucked its edge around the trees as well. So if I pull this back a bit, I'm going to compromise to something around there. So that's given us a really nice sort of fit around that mask. Now we can always go back and tweak that later if we want, but I think that's actually about right. So now if I press M again on my keyboard, like so, now we've got a good opportunity, if I just play with exposure, to pull in and out exactly how I want it. Now I don't want to make it too sort of correct, if you like, because that's not very natural. So I'm going to go to about here and put in a little bit of extra clarity, like so. And also probably on our background layer, because the trees could take it as well. If we zoom into 100%, let's bust up the structure a bit, and that would just accentuate all those nice details and so on. So lovely super sharp shot from John. Now if we zoom in, how good is that mask? So I know I'm at 200%, but let's turn this layer on and off And you see how nicely it sort of blends in and fits with the surroundings. So you'd never know I'd thrown that mask in there, and it just does a really, really nice job. Now, once again, if you feel you've overcooked it too much, we can always go back to that adjustment layer, and then we can bring the opacity down to get it something like a little bit more natural. Now, last job that I would like to do, if we go to the background and in my color editor, I'm just going to go advanced. I want to pick the color of the trees around here, and I just want to lighten these guys up a touch because we've got some nice sunlight coming in from the side. So I think if I just lighten those a bit, that's going to just only make that look even better. So again, artistic choices. You could decide on this adjustment layer how far you want to go with that. So do you want to make it look very realistic or closer to what it was in real life? But as I say, I think my bias around there was pretty good. Oh, Vernon just discovered his sound was off because it was going to his external monitor. So glad to hear it wasn't my fault. All right, let's have a look at some questions and see where we're at. Remember, there was a question I saw in the chat. Phil said, perhaps have this window up as well for the chat and questions, David. I'm trying, Phil. I've got 3 places to look, so I'm doing my best. As I said, I'll just pick out the questions which make sense to today's webinar. So if we don't get to your personal question, please don't be offended. Sarah didn't catch what to press to get the black and white mask. So over here, you can see display grayscale mask or option M. So if we choose this now, then you'll see the grayscale mask like so. When you're setting a luminosity mask, it's just kind of a lot easier to see it in grayscale as opposed to red because you can't really sort of see the fine detail of it. So option M or in the tools there. Irene was asking if you draw from the middle of the picture, will the mask not affect the top? No, it's always going to affect the top. So you're asking for like a central mask, I guess. You could delete the top of it afterwards if you wanted to. You'd have to rasterize it first, but otherwise, no, it will still be in the top. Let's see. Let's pick out 2 more. When to use natural clarity or sensitivity clarity was asking. So if we go down to the clarity tool, to be honest, I always stick with natural 99% of the time. What punch does, if we change that, you just see it's a little bit more punchy. It also boosts the saturation slightly, but you might have to be a bit more careful with how far you can push it. So just be aware of that. But natural is my go-to one. Punch boosts up the saturation slightly and is a bit heavier. Neutral is kind of in between those two, and classic is a really old version which looks kind of crappy most of the time. So yeah, simple as that, really. Did we really need the graduated mask before the luminosity, or could we have just used the luminosity? You could have probably got away with luminosity, but I did want a slight fall off from top to bottom. And it's also nice to see that you can add a luma mask to the gradient as well. Okay, let's go over to Facebook and YouTube and have a look-see. Let's see. Can we make the reflections higher? You could make these brighter if you wanted to. So what I would do is I would make a new field adjustment layer, and I would probably use brightness just to bump those up a bit and maybe a bit contrastier. And then that's just giving me the ability to visualize that, and I'm going to get rid of the mask, but it's going to keep my adjustments underneath. Grab my adjustment brush, go over to the water. I'm going to make this nice and soft, a nice low flow. We'll talk about that more in a second, and then we can just brighten up this spot like so. Maybe we could even brighten up our little sunspot down here as well, like so. So yes, we could do that. Let's just have a quick looky-dook through the rest of Facebook and YouTube. For those of you asking about future features, my lips are sealed. I'm afraid I can't tell you what's coming, what isn't coming. We don't normally make a point of talking about the future roadmap, so you'll just have to wait and see, I'm afraid. Okay, let's move on to the next shot. Oh, and the last question from Alan said, can the luminosity be put on any mask? Yes. So if you draw a mask, you can add Luma range constraint to it with a gradient mask. You can do it with a radial mask. So it's just like an extra layer, if you like, on top of that mask. All right, so let's go to our next shot. Let's have a look at our foodie one, because that's quite simple, but it's a good combination of HDR sliders and so on and so forth. So this is from my good buddy Nick out in New Zealand. So I said, Nick, I just need a quick, simple food shot in daylight. What have you got? So he sent me this last night. And we can tell where the lighting's coming from, sort of back left-ish a bit, I get. So lovely natural soft light, but it's a little bit muddy at the front. So we just want to improve contrast and bump this up a little bit. And yes, John, this is where we will use the exposure warning, as John is asking in the webinar room, because we can do a little bit of adjustment here to make sure that our highlights are retained, but kind of lift everything a bit as well. So I think it's a bit cold, and the clue is kind of given here in histogram, because you see my blue channel is bumping out to the right. So I reckon that's a prevalent color tone. So if we look at our RGB figures up the top here, we can see blue is taking precedence. So I could just grab my picker and click on the background, and that will warm it up a bit. But to be honest, I think that's too much. So I just want to warm it up a little bit. And notice how the blue has started to sneak back towards the rest of the histogram. And finally, I'm going to lift up the exposure a touch, and also the brightness, which is just going to lift our midtones slightly as well. Now, if I say auto on my levels, it's just going to snap our shadows and highlights next to each other as well. So that's actually a pretty good start. Now, what about our exposure warning? So if I turn this on, we're going to see a potentially blown out area in the back. But again, if we look at the numbers, we see nothing has hit critical levels yet. And the reason why I'm seeing my warnings is because if we go to preferences, I like to start to see my warnings kind of creep in at a certain point. So you see, as I adjust the warnings, then it's apparent on the photo as well. So I'm not too worried about this area right now. So I'm going to turn that off for a second. So what I want to do is maybe even brighten the surroundings a bit more. So we're going to grab a radial mask. So Charles says, damn, that bolognese looks good. That's the whole point of food photography, eh? It's got to look tasty and make us hungry, of course. So I'm going to make this a little bit softer, like so. So if I press M on my keyboard, you can see where the mask is, kind of fitting quite nicely around our tasty plate. And what I want to do is bring up brightness and just lift the overall background a bit. Now, if everyone's starting to worry about this area up the top here, you see now, if we look at the numbers, 255, 255, 255, that's blown out a little bit. So if we turn our exposure warning, we can we can see that. But what we can do is just bring back those very brightest tones with the white slider. So I'm going to bring the whites down, and that's just going to clean that up quite nicely. But I'm still going to get my little exposure bump from my radial mask. So if I turn this off and on, like so, it's lifted that area, but we haven't blown out anything in the background. Let's just crop a bit tighter. So let's grab our crop tool. Just going to zoom in a little bit, like so. There we go. So a bit of careful fiddling with the HDR sliders really in combination with the radial mask. So just important that it's balanced, but again, not getting too worried about it being totally blown out, but the white slider being able to pull that back and the radial lift everything else as well. Okie dokie. So I would probably leave that about there. The only thing I might do, if I go back to the background, if we look at the blacks isn't doing a lot. That's just in the meatiest bits, if you like. So shadows I might raise just a hair, and blacks in the other way. That's kind of improving the contrast just in the darker tones. So by lifting the shadows, dropping the blacks, but without affecting the contrast anywhere else, like so. Alrighty, looking at some questions. Okay, anyone with a technical question, it's kind of hard to answer in the webinar, I hope you understand. So if you do have an issue, just write to support.captureone.com and then we can help you out. So that's the best thing to do. Dave says, my radial mask works opposite. Where is that setting? You probably inverted it at some point, Dave. So if we pick radial mask back up, so make sure you've got your radial cursor tool highlighted. And if we go hover in, we can see our mask. Right click, and you've probably got draw mask inside checked, like so. So that will flip it, Dave. Okay. So if we flip that, then it's going to be the absolute opposite. So the default, whoops, come back. The default is to have the mask on the outside, but you can also have the mask on the inside. So I can imagine that's kind of frustrating, Dave, if that's not working. Could we get rid of the blue glass? Oh, maybe. That was Annette who was asking. So I don't know. If we grab a very large healing brush, and let's just go over around here. We might have to help out Capture One with the source. And let's just pull this up a bit to around here. Not bad. I'd say might have to do a little bit of fiddling around and getting a better source for it, but because it's on a very soft background, it might be a little bit tricky. But I think with a bit of effort we could probably take that out. Maybe my mask was a bit too big. Let's make that a bit smaller, like so, and I'll pick a source over here. So maybe not. I think with a bit of care and a bit of fiddling around I might be able to get rid of it, but probably you don't want to watch me do that. You can also flip your radial mask inside out, Serge says, kind of like flipping a sock. Yes. Oh, that's a good tip actually. If we could pick out the color on our advanced color editor, like so, and then I could desaturate that just to kind of make it less noticeable as well. That's also an idea. Good analogy with flipping a sock. Could we make the source colors pop out more without impacting the saturation of the rest of the image? Yeah, so if we picked out the color tones here, so you can see now in the advanced color editor we've got the boundaries of the colors we're going to affect. So if I change lightness, so just to give you an idea of what it's affecting, so if you wanted the saturation up a bit you could do so, and you can make it a bit darker. And we could also make sure we're not affecting the lower saturated tones, so we could tweak that up as well. There's a whole webinar on color editing, so if this area looks intriguing, then I'd recommend watching that as well. Why did I use the highlight slider instead of why did I use the white slider instead of the highlight slider? That's a good question. The reason being because I only wanted to affect if we go back to this adjustment layer, I only wanted to affect the brightest white. So what are we at? -47. Let's reset that. If I bring the highlights down, it's almost going to negate what my radial mask is doing. So I didn't want it to do that because I brightened up the outside like so. So I just wanted to make sure that this area, based on the exposure warnings, wasn't too blown out. So that's why I used the whites, because that's treating the upper echelon of those of the histogram. Let's see. How do we focus the spaghetti? Is it out of focus? It's just shallow depth of field. So you can see our depth of field plane like so. Now if something is out of focus you can't make it sharp, but you can enhance the sharpness that is already there, for example. Let's see. Tiago was asking about sharpening. I'm not going to talk about sharpening much today, but again you can look at the tutorials or back catalogue of webinars that we have as well, and you'll be able to see that. Just check in the last few questions, and otherwise I think we can move on. Let's just have a look in the little webinar room just in case as well. Oh, can we see the before and after? Of course we can. So let's see before. So hit our before and after button. We can whiz through like so. So a little bit warmer, a bit brighter, a bit higher key, more contrasty, and so on. Actually, we didn't do before and after on the other shot, did we? I just rushed off. So, and there's the before and after on this guy as well. So more contrast in the mountains, bit of brightness in the trees, our little reflection lake improvement by request, and our gradient mask, of course. Right, let's move on to a super awesome shot from Chris Gibbs in Alaska. Great shot of this guy. Did a whole series of these of a dog trainer in deepest, darkest Alaska. Not aware of the dog breed. Dog fans out there might know what it is. Could be a husky puppy, actually. So originally I'd intended to edit this as a black and white, but it actually turned out nicer with color and a bit of color grading. So if you're expecting a black and white, sorry to disappoint you, because this actually came out really, really nicely in color. So first thing I'm going to do on this shot is actually crop it, because we've got some distracting kind of machinery out the back here. So let's come in for a tighter crop. So I'm going to favor something like this, because it's all about the faces, right? So sometimes I'll crop straight away, and I'm going to get rid of the viewer labels. That's these labels down the bottom, because I find them distracting sometimes. And click on this button up here, which turns on my proof mode, kind of frames the shot. Sometimes, again, I find that easier for editing as well. So I think this is the crop that I'm going to go with. We could fiddle for hours with that, so I'll try to be relatively concise. Maybe I don't like the fact that I've cut his paws off, so let's do that. I think that's going to be better. There we go. So I prefer that. Right, now before I do anything else, kind of base exposure and all that kind of stuff looks good. Nothing wrong there. What the issue with this shot is, or not the issue with this shot, but this area, so pup and handler, can actually take quite a lot of contrast and clarity to sort of bring out all that detail and structure and so on, whereas the jacket, if we overload it too much, then we start to get no detail in the shadows and so on and so forth. So that's not great. So first of all, let's dial in the amount of contrast that I think the jacket can take, and the amount of clarity that the jacket can take, which is kind of about here. Already that's looking a lot more dynamic. So if we turn on before and after, let's look at our full view. So before and after, already looking much better. But I think the fur on the top of the pup's head here is kind of getting a bit bright, so I want to be mindful of that. And also the face could probably have a bit more. So I'm just going to back this off a little touch, and we're going to make a new field layer, field adjustment layer. So I want to experiment with a few adjustments to see what we can do to kind of improve this bit even further. So it's going to be a combination of adjustments, but I'm not quite sure what's going to work. So looking at these two in a bit more detail, I think that we could have even more contrast, like so. We could have a bit more clarity, and I'm probably pushing it harder than I normally would. I want to be mindful of these highlights, so let's bring the highlights down and the whites. Let's just take that down a bit. And also structure wise, we can add in some of that, because that's going to accentuate the different fur, feathers, his eyebrows, his awesome beard, all that kind of stuff. But it's probably a bit over the top now. If we turn this field layer off and on, then it's a bit too harsh for everything else, and it's making our background stand out as well, which isn't good. But it's kind of good for our central subjects. So I'm happy with what potentially could happen there, but now I need to right click, get rid of this mask, like so, grab my brush, and then decide where to paint this back in. Now when I'm going to paint this back in, this setting flow, we're going to keep nice and low, so that as I brush, a flow of 4 as it's set now is going to build up the mask nice and slowly in like 4% increments. So it means I can just gradually build up the effect in the areas that I want to, concentrating a bit more in other areas than some. So now we've got that set, we can just brush over here nicely, and then down across the dog, and then sort of back and forward a little bit as well. I'm going to avoid the top of the head too much, because otherwise it might get a bit a bit too sort of bright and so on. So just a little bit more here, a little bit more down there, like so, a little bit on the paws, not too much on the hand, and then kind of stick to that. So now if we turn this layer on and off and back on, so it's just subtly affecting those areas, but not the jacket or anything like that, for example. So that looks pretty good now, I would think. Let's zoom into 100%. Let's just hide my head for a second, just so we can pan around the whole shot. And I think that looks not too bad, actually, if you're in agreement with me. But there's still a few little bits to go, because I think obviously we've got some hairs here, so we could get rid of those. And we might actually throw in a color grade as well, which could be interesting. Is there a way to fix his skin? I saw someone was asking. Well, I'm not sure I'd want to fix his skin really, because it's an environmental portrait. We could maybe get rid of some of the color difference, so we might do that. Let's first of all grab our healing brush, and let's right click and pull down our and just make our brush a little bit smaller, and let's just get rid of some of these hairs like so. So I'm just going to move that source slightly, just so we can line up the string on his hoodie, like that. Oh, that actually hasn't done the best job, so I'm going to delete that one. And let's do that in a couple of pushes, like so. So one for there, and then let's grab that one. That's better. Let's take the little one over there, and let's choose that source so we can line up the crease in his jacket. There we go. And let's get rid of this one. I'm not going to do all of these because I know that's not super exciting, you watching me get rid of dog fur, but you get the idea that we could clean up this area quite nicely as well. Whoops, Siri's just kicked off in the background. Shush. Let's do that one and this one. Going to just zoom in a little bit more. Let's grab my healing brush again. Oops, wrong shortcut. That's the focus mask. If ever you see the focus mask with this strange green stuff over your shot, that's why. So let's pull that. Let's get that one and so on. That's lined up with the crease in his jacket rather nicely, which is good. And those two as well. Okay, so let's have a look. Oh my God, he's doing away with the dog fur. Just a few of those bits. Someone this morning said they found it super distracting, so we can just get rid of some of those. Now if we look at before and after, let's just see our arrows, then that just gets rid of some of those. Now if I want to fix any of those, let's grab my healing brush once more. This one needs a little fix actually. If you want to do a fine fix, you can select it and then use your cursor keys and then just jog that. One more jog like so, just so it lines up with that crease nicely. That's better. So I want to throw a color grade into this. So let's make a new filled layer, field adjustment layer like so. And this is going to be just a little bit of a color grade. So I think for this, I'm going to take the saturation down because I want more muted tones. Go to my color balance tool. That's this guy here. And then we're just going to cool down our shadows. Let's warm up our midtones and highlights a little bit, not too much, like so. And just deepen our shadows slightly. So that's our just a little subtle color grading tint on top. And once again, we can, if you've gone too far, if you like, or we just want to balance it a bit, we can go all the way in between by changing the opacity. So I'm going to go with something like that as well. Now if you wanted to change the skin tone color, actually with our color grading it's reduced a bit, but what we could do, let's make a new field adjustment layer and we call this skin tone, like so. And if we go to our skin tone tab and we want to pick the skin tone color we like, so I'm going to choose this one and expand out our color wheel. And what we're doing here is defining all the sort of skin tone ranges that we want to normalize. And now I'm going to bring hue across. And you see, if you look at his nose, see that kind of pinky tint on the end here. As we bring the hue slider across, see how it now normalizes everything out like so. And we could do the same for saturation and lightness, but lightness will probably flatten it out too much. So we have a little bit of that, but it could be affecting some other areas in the shot. In this case, it might not. So if we turn that on and off, I think we can get away with it being on the whole layer. But what I would normally do is right click, clear that mask, grab my brush, let's go full flow in this case, and then we would just brush on. See how his nose changed color? Just our skin tone correction like so. So that will normalize to that point. And what I could also do is just bring the general saturation down a bit as well, like so. So there's, I think, quite a nice finished shot. So if we hit before and after, so that's before and after, or we can press Y on our keyboard as well as our shortcut, or we can have our split view slider, if you remember, and then let's wipe between the two like so. So pretty simple edit, but just a little bit color grading, bit skin correction, clarity structure, just to kind of bump up those details. Phil says, why did I ever use Lightroom? Good question. I can't answer that. It says, why is the dog's fur now pink? It's probably just part of just warming up the color grading. So that's all. It doesn't look pink on my screen. There's a little kind of tinge there maybe, but that's all. But there we go. So yes, why did we ever use Lightroom? That is the question. Too much contrast for me. Well, the good thing is, if we take off our before and after. So what was our layers? See, this is why you should always name your layers, because I can't remember what each one was doing now. So that was our face. So again, we could bring the opacity down if it's too contrasty. That's our heel layer, and then this one, our other adjustment layer. That was just our overall color grade. But again, if it's too contrasty, then of course we could just take down these a little bit as well. Lots of different ways to go. If we look at what we did this morning, I doubt it's going to look similar, but we started off with a black and white like so, and then we went to this one, that was a tighter crop, and then this one that we did right now. So I actually think the tighter crop is a little bit nicer, but you guys can decide, of course. Right, let's look at some questions. How are we doing for time? Q&A. Let's see, what can we do? What key do you use to zoom in and out so fast? So when I'm on the pan tool, that's a good question. This one here, that's H on your keyboard as a shortcut. If you double click, you can zoom into 100%. Double click, you can zoom back out. Simple as that. When you've zoomed in, if you do a right click, you actually get a mini navigator to pan around the screen as well, like so. So that's by and large, I think, the fastest way. Or you can click plus or minus up in the top right hand corner of your viewer. Am I using a tablet and pen? Yes, I am. It's just a Wacom Intuos Pro Medium. Don't have to spend the money on a Pro. The Intuos normal ones, non-pro, whatever they're called, are equally as good as well, and just make things like local adjustments much easier and more fluid and faster to use, and so on. Could we do anything about this bright area in the top right hand corner? We might be able to heal that out. That's a good question. So if we grab our heal layer and a brush, let's just see what we can do. Let's grab this spot. Might be able to blend in a little bit. There we go, like so. So that's just taken out that bright spot. I might just add a bit more like so. There we go. So yeah, we could certainly remove that distracting one, as well as the dog hairs that annoyed everybody this morning. Let's go over to YouTube and Facebook. Sophia, I think you're answering someone's question, but yeah, sometimes my technique can look a bit odd. The reason why I start with filling the mask first is that you can then play around with the adjustments, like a combination, see what works best, clear the mask, and then you can brush it back in where you need to. Otherwise, you kind of have to draw a mask first and then play with adjustments, which to me seems a little bit counterintuitive. So that's right. Just going over to Facebook and YouTube as well. Do I not use pen pressure? I had it turned off. No. Hi John, by the way, nice to see you. I don't use pen pressure. Pen pressure in, let's just go to an adjustment layer. Pen pressure will affect the size only, but what I tend to do is just quickly right click to get up my brush settings, mostly because I'm not deft enough to moderate the pressure to size. I think that's one additional action which my brain can't cope with. If you want to get rid of the heel arrows, so where's our heel layer? So these guys, when you go off the image they disappear. If you want to hide them permanently, again we've got display arrow checkbox. So if you find them distracting on a face edit or something like that, then yes, you can definitely turn those off. Hope that helps. Okay, one more question. Karen says, is there a shortcut, Corinne, sorry, says, is there a shortcut list available? Yes. So if you go to edit keyboard shortcuts, let's just go to the default, for example, then you can press summarize and that will open a web page of your particular ones, and you can hit plus to make your own keyboard shortcut sets as well. So that's the best way to do it. Last question from Trish: why can't you use the Luma mask when you're offline? The reason being, if you have an offline file, which means it's probably on an external hard drive which is disconnected, to create the Luma mask we need the raw data to make it accurate, otherwise it wouldn't be a very useful mask. So the reason why we need that is simply so we can create a good luminosity mask. Okay, all right. Let's move on, I think. Otherwise we could be answering questions all day. Maybe we just need to do a Q&A at some point. Right, what's next? How many have we got through and how much time is left? So we have actually got through 3 shots. Amazing. Let's go to a wedding photo. This one is fairly easy. I wanted to pick out a wedding shot just to talk about a little trick that you can do with styles as well. Styles are very popular in the wedding community for a consistent look and for speed, of course. So this is a shot from one of our ambassadors, Victor Ham, and his partner, who make up Muse and Mirror, wedding photographers out of Germany. They've also created a style pack, which is what you can see on the left hand side as well. Now before we apply the style, there was great controversy this morning about should we straighten this or not. So let's use our straighten tool anyway. I kind of liked it on the angle, but I was overruled by everyone else. So let's just have a straighter shot like so. You can rotate by hovering on the edge of the crop and just by tweaking. So I think it looks slightly better even if it's not perfectly straight. Let's hide my browser. Command B. And if you're working with styles, then of course you have the choice. Like the style isn't the be all and end all. It's like complementing some environmental adjustments like exposure, white balance and so on. So what should you do first? Well, if the shot is completely underexposed, overexposed, or needs correcting to some extent, you should do that first. Now this shot is kind of pretty good out of camera, what I expect for a strong window light and the lighting it's in. So I'm not going to play around with that too much. I'm going to go over to our user styles, the Muse and Mirror styles, which are called Legacy, and pick one that I like. I quite like this one, number 4. Now one click will apply that style and apply all the settings related to that style. Now to make it much more flexible, a good tip is to right click and say apply to new layer, and that will essentially make you a style layer. So it will give you a layer with the style, but the ability to change the opacity, mess around with the mask, to punch holes in it, or change the opacity of the mask, all kinds of things. So if I say apply to new layer and we go over to my layers tool, you can now see, oh, I didn't want number 3, I wanted number 4. Sorry, right click, apply to new layer. Now if we go over to the layers, we've got a style layer essentially. So that's applying all the adjustments of that style on a layer. So now if I feel it's too strong, actually looks quite nice, then I can just back this down a bit. So that's no adjustments all the way up to the full style. So I'm going to go somewhere in between like so. Now that's actually a fairly nice edit of that shot. The only thing that I want to do, if I zoom in, is just maybe open up the shadows a little bit on her face. Just it's a bit too dark for my liking. So if I go to my background layer, because I want to keep the style as a separate entity, and lift up the blacks, then we can do so, but it's also opening up this area too much. So we kind of want to restrict it just to her kind of back, arm and face and so on. So again, what I'm going to do, going back to Sophia's comment, I think, is I'm going to make a new field adjustment layer. So that's basically a mask over the whole shot. I'm now going to focus my eyes just on her, and then bring up the blacks until I think it's about right, which is somewhere around there. I might go a little bit more than I think, and then go back to my layer and say clear mask. Now let's give this a name so I don't forget what the heck it was again. So facelift, that's unkind, not a facelift. Shadow lift. Capture One cannot do facelifts. There we go, shadow lift. So now I'm going to grab my brush. I'll go in a bit closer so you can see what's going on. Make this smaller and bring the flow nice and low. And now I can just gradually paint a little bit here, down here, just to lift those shadows ever so slightly, and a touch on her arm as well, so it doesn't look unbalanced. So if we turn this layer off and back on, it's a tiny bit, but it just opens up the shadows ever so slightly without affecting what's going on in the background. Let's crop tighter. Actually, I think this is an A7R4, so there's plenty of megapixels to deal with. So once again, if we turn that off and back on, then just lifting up those shadows a bit, and we could even do just a bit more there if we wanted to. So a simple little tweak, but you can use that really on any shot. If you need to do something targeted, or like control highlights, control shadows, but it's messing up some other aspect of the shot, then there's no reason why you can't just, you know, hone in on one particular spot with a local adjustment. So let's see before and after. So we can bring our slider across like so. So nice simple edit. It was actually pretty nice out of camera. Just the style adds a bit of color toning, softens it a little bit as well, and actually brings our highlights down as well. So this is certainly extreme ranges of contrast, so it's nice that we can end up with a shot that works with both as well. Full view, before and after, like so. Okay, doing well for time. Let's have a look at some questions. I'm just going to scroll up a bit because I'm aware I've probably missed some of the earlier ones. Irene was asking, do I ever edit an image from scratch, or do you ever apply styles and presets? There we go. So there's your example. And as I said, I think when you apply a style, if you need to fix something, do that first and then put the style. But having the style as a layer, as a separate entity, just gives you much more control. Is before and after always global? Alan was asking. I'm not sure what you mean. It goes back to the raw file with the exception of composition. So notice when we do before and after, it doesn't rotate or uncrop, because that would be sort of distracting as well. We wouldn't really be able to compare before and after if it was jumping around with a different crop and so on and so forth. What's the technical difference between basic color editing and skin tone when working with selecting those colors? So in between these two, they essentially do the same job. The skin tone tool just has an additional bank of sliders which helps to create that uniformity which we saw earlier. So that's really the main difference, is the uniformity sliders. Also, the sliders are more or less sensitive, so they have smaller range, so their effect is kind of a little bit more nuanced and a bit softer as well. Let's see. Given the power of adjusting mask using LumaRange, would you recommend using a rough freehand mask for complicated selection and using LumaRange to refine the mask? I'm thinking about hair selection and other specific details in portraits. Yeah, that's actually a good technique, is just to do a quick and dirty mask around something and then hit it with a Luma mask. What I'd actually tried to do with this shot when I was playing around with it was just draw roughly along the tree line and then do a Luma mask, and then it did pick out the trees, but then I kind of had to add in the rest of the mask. It was just easier at the end of the day to do a gradient mask. But sometimes you can just draw around an object and say LumaRange, or use the refine mask function, and then that works pretty good as well. Okay, going over to Facebook and YouTube. Again, for about, are you going to add in the future? Zip, lips are sealed, I'm afraid. So we never talk about, well, we do sometimes, but about the future roadmap. So, but if you have a feature request, make a support case, support.capture1.com. Do that, and then that way we officially log all the feature requests that come in. So please log them, because the more people who say I would like such and such, the more likely it is to happen as well. Anthony was saying he was having trouble with his Wacom. I would say whenever your Wacom hiccups, which mine does every now and then, is to either check that they have new drivers, which they quite often do, and if that doesn't work, uninstall the driver, reinstall, and that generally fixes everything. You might find there's, if you're on Catalina, there's some permissions issues with access as well, so you have to make sure you cross all the T's and dot all the I's to get it working properly across the system. Handy tip question from Rob: how do you get a slider back to 0? Very easily. What were we editing? This one, wasn't it? So if you want to reset any slider to 0, just double tap and that takes it back to 0. So double tap anywhere on the slider bar. Okay. Does this before and after slider exist in previous versions? No, it was added 1 week ago, week and a half ago. What day is it today? Thursday. So it was added Monday week. So if you're not seeing it, then you need to update your version of Capture One. No, when you open an image in Capture One, do we kill it so it can't open in Adobe products? That would be fun, wouldn't it? No, we don't do that, of course. That would be very illegal and very frustrating. So no, we certainly don't do anything to the file that doesn't make it open. That sounds more like a permissions issue or something like that. But nothing that we do at all. And last question before we go on to the last thing, and I think we are probably good. And again, if I don't answer your specific question, please don't be offended. There's just lots of you guys in and around YouTube, Facebook, and in the webinar room as well. Last one from Drew: how do you activate Luma Mask? So once you've drawn a mask, let's just pick another shot. So once we've drawn a mask, then any mask can have its LumaRange applied to it. So you hit the LumaRange button up here, and then Capture One will build your LumaRange mask, and then you can go ahead and apply that constraint to it. But if you don't have a mask, then that LumaRange button is grayed out. So Capture One needs something to work with as well. All right, last shot, 5 minutes, going to be a speed edit. So let's grab this one, quick lifestyle shot from our ambassador, John Shell. Thank you, John. Now this doesn't really need a great deal of editing, and this is one of those shots where you would think, I must correct all the solar and lens flare and bring it back to normal, but then you would completely destroy the intent of the shot in the first place. So we're never going to be able to get rid of the flare and all those things, but we want to do is just kind of enhance what's there. Now the Horizon Police will be shouting at me soon, so I need to correct the angle, like so. Now I would actually prefer it wonky, but definitely I'll be shouted at if I don't fix that. So generally it's actually pretty good. Now if we turn on our exposure warnings, we probably are going to have to expect that we've lost a lot of the highlights and shadows, but potentially if we bring the whites back, we could actually bring a lot of that back in as well. But the reason why I don't often work with exposure warning is because you can't really see what it's doing to the shot. Like, how is that affecting this from an artistic perspective? So yes, we could say this is more correct, but has it made the shot look totally weird? So I can tell from the histogram just by looking at it that we're losing our highlight details, but in this case we might just have to live with that. But if I bring the whites down a little bit, see, that would be the technically correct one, but now it's kind of solarized along this edge. So we could do that, but now it just looks flat and lifeless and no good. So I would bring my whites down a little bit, but I would still want to keep it true to the effect that we were trying to get. I would probably up my contrast and clarity a touch as well, not too much, and bring in the shadows. That will just help bringing up the contrast and reducing the flare on him somewhat. And then color wise, we've kind of got a decision here. Do we try and correct the warm tones, or do we go with it, or do we do a combination in between? Because if I take the white balance down, we can get a bit more of the blue sea back, but we're losing the warmth of the sun. But what we could do in our midtones in the color balance tool, let's make this bigger, is move that towards the warmer tones like so. So we get a bit of the turquoisey sea goodness going on, but we also get a bit of the warmth back from the sun, and we could also do the highlights to some extent as well. So if we bring up before and after once more, let's have a look at the split view. So if we bring up before, so a little bit flat, a bit lacking in color, and then if we bring up after, we've still got the warm tones, but we've restored some of the water tone as well. So it's not a massive edit, but it's just showing what we can do with a few gentle tweaks, but not ruining the atmosphere, for example. Irene cannot live with the sea's horizon being skewed. So there we go. I'm glad that we fixed it. So if we just bring up all the different edits for a second on screen, got to remember which is which, spag, and like so. So let's turn off proofing view, hide my browser, and then look, we can do sliders all at the same time. There we go. So there's all our befores, there's all our afters, as you can see. So I hope that's a satisfying end game to the little task that we had today. Still time for 2 or 3 minutes worth of questions, which is good. And let's have a look in the webinar room. You need to Dutch tilt the horizon line again. It's pretty lifeless now. Yeah, I would actually prefer it on the wonk, but I think that's one of those artistic choices that we would have to make. Okay, let's have a look at the questions. I think we're pretty good there for the minute. Let's just have a look in the chat. Okay, let's go over to Facebook and YouTube. Can you do dodge and burn in Capture One? Yeah, and we did briefly a little bit of it with this one. It's the same kind of technique, really. Fill a layer, decide on the adjustments you want to do. So if you were brightening or dodging, I guess. I tend to call it brightening and darkening because I get confused with the darkroom terms because it's kind of opposite. But anyway, if you wanted to selectively brighten a photo, you would fill the layer, use the adjustments you want, like exposure or brightness or something like that, and then just brush it back in with a low flow, and then you could get that really nice balance between darkening and lightening and so on. So yes, you could do that. So that's how can we dodge and burn. And I've done that plenty of times in other webinars. I think one of the quick lives might have been a dodge and burn. So if you look on our YouTube channel on our playlist, look for the one called Quick Live, and you'll find all kinds of short edits there. And one of those I'm sure is dodge and burning. If it's not, that's a subject I'm going to do because that could be very useful. Garon was asking, can you blur the background? Yes and no. You can do negative clarity and negative structure, but it's not the same as like a true Gaussian blur, but it's quite popular in use a lot of the time, and I have seen it being used for that, so you could try that. Better the Horizon Police than the Copenhagen Police. Exactly. Hopefully haven't seen any of them today as well. Sophia says, how would you lower the whites if you have a previous version of Capture One? You can still do it, but it's a lot more long-winded. So what you would have to do if you just wanted to affect like the brightest whites or the darkest shadows, then you could fill a mask and create a luminosity mask on top of that, just for whichever tonal range you want. And then you would essentially get a similar edit to the white slider. It's just a lot more, you know, complex than pulling a white slider, but it is possible. So Sophia, just try that. Is there an earlier tutorial explaining the difference between clarity, structure, and sharpening? I've mentioned it a few times, Jim, but clarity, in a nutshell, mid-tone contrast adjustment. Structure, enhancing 5 details. Sharpening, similar to structure, but it's a bit more of a finer tool. Structure is a bit of a sledgehammer approach. If you push it too hard, it's going to look crappy. Sharpening is going to be have a bit more control. Go to Paul Reifer's channel, or Paul Reifer. He's one of our ambassadors. Go to his YouTube channel, and him and I did a Q&A, and we actually answered that question extensively, Jim, with a few examples. So check out his channel as well. Let's see. Barry would love to have a color range to create masks. Yeah, that would be nice to combine luma and color, just in case you never discovered it, because it's kind of hidden. You can create a masked layer from your color selection. So if you pick out a blue, you can transform that to a mask as well. But to have some kind of hybrid of the two, Barry, that would be super nice. Yeah, the boat is not going to sail anywhere with a straight horizon. That's very true. And I think, as we're 1 minute over, I'm going to pick out one more question. Can Capture One not correct the flares? Well, I think any software would struggle to correct those, because it's like a random pattern, and I don't think I'd want to, really. We could go in and gradually dodge and burn and try and remove them all, but to what end, really? If that wasn't the intention, then John wouldn't have shot it like that. He would have picked a different viewpoint, and there's a whole series of these shots from different viewpoints, but that's one of the nice ones too, I would think. Alrighty, I think that brings us to the end of today's discussion. So thanks for joining us. And again, if we couldn't get to your personal question, apologies. There was rather a lot of you. Hundreds in here, you know, hundreds on, I say hundreds, I could be lying, hundreds on YouTube and Facebook. So it's tricky to have eyes in 3 places. So there we go. But thanks again for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your Thursdays, Fridays, and the weekend when it comes as well. And the last great comment from John: correct the flares by steering the boat around. There you go. Get it right in camera, and then you don't have to edit them out. So thanks everybody, and see you all soon. Have a good one. Bye now.